In the echo of clattering trays and midday chatter, a black girl's quiet stomach aches seemed no more than growing pains to Jefferson Middle's staff. To the lunch lady, she was just another kid supposed to eat what was served. No questions asked. What the woman couldn't see was a daughter guided by her mother's watchful eye, a teen whose keen intuition and careful documentation would expose the rot hidden in bland cafeterias and polite facades. When mold turned into evidence of targeted cruelty, their fight for proof would ignite a reckoning far beyond the lunchroom. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Zaria Freeman sat 2 rows from the front, tapping her pencil against the side of her desk as Ms. Leland paced slowly across the whiteboard, explaining fractions no one seemed to care about. The hum of the overhead lights buzzed above her like tired bees, and the room smelled faintly of dry erase markers and floor wax. It was the kind of day that passed quietly, unremarkably, until lunch came. And then, as it had for the past few weeks, her stomach began to churn. It always started the same way. A dull ache just under her ribs, creeping lower, growing sharper with each passing minute. She shifted in her seat, one arm wrapped around her midsection, but she didn't say anything. Not when the bell rang. Not when her classmates sprang up, chattering about video games, TikToks, and whose mom was picking them up today. Not even when Aubrey, her lab partner, asked if she was okay. Zaria just smiled faintly, said she was fine, and gathered her things. In the cafeteria, the noise hit like it always did. Trays clattering, sneakers squeaking, the occasional burst of laughter echoing off painted cinder-block walls. She joined the lunch line, ignoring the throbbing in her stomach, already familiar with the rhythm of pain. She took the tray handed to her by the lunch lady without looking too hard. It didn't matter what it was, grilled cheese or ham sandwich, bruised apples or cups of watery corn. It all tasted the same after a while. Today it was turkey on wheat, a few slices of carrot sticks, and a milk carton that always felt too warm. She sat at the end of the third table like she usually did, close enough to not seem like she was avoiding everyone, but far enough that she didn't have to fake small talk if she didn't feel up to it. She took a bite of the sandwich. Her teeth hit something sour, almost metallic. Her body tensed, but she forced herself to swallow. Throwing it away would mean going hungry, and going back for another would invite attention. By 7th period, the cramps were back full force. Sweat dotted her temples as she leaned against her locker, pretending to dig for a book she didn't need. Her hands trembled, just slightly. She thought about the nurse's office, but she already knew what would happen. A pat on the back, a cup of water, and a tight smile. "You're probably just stressed, sweetheart. Try to get some sleep tonight." No one ever seemed to ask what was really going on, and Zaria wasn't the kind of girl to cause scenes. That evening, at the dinner table, her mom watched her push baked chicken around her plate with a fork. "Z, that's the 3rd time this week you've barely touched your food," Amara said, her tone even but concerned. "I'm just not that hungry. You came home pale. Again. Baby, are you still getting those stomach aches?" Zaria shrugged, eyes fixed on her plate. "It's probably just my period, or the flu going around." Amara didn't answer right away. She set down her water glass, watching her daughter closely. The flicker of discomfort in Zaria's eyes wasn't new, but lately it had taken on a sharper edge, like she was trying not just to hide pain, but to endure it. "Tell me the truth," Amara said gently. "Is it the school lunches?" Zaria hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe. Sometimes it tastes weird. But it's not like I'm the only one eating it. No one else is getting sick?" Zaria shook her head slowly. "Then you need to start checking your food. Before you eat. Every bite." She nodded. Not because she believed it would change anything, but because it was easier than arguing. But something in her mother's voice made her pause. It wasn't just worry. It was a warning. A quiet one. The kind that said, "Trust your gut, even if no one else will." The next day, she sat at the same spot in the cafeteria, her tray in front of her. She looked at it differently now. Not with hunger, not with expectation, but with quiet suspicion. The bread looked fine. She peeled it back. The meat, pale and thin, was curled at the edges. She sniffed it. There was something off. Not quite rotten, not quite fresh. She looked around. Other kids were laughing, trading Oreos and grape juice boxes, not thinking twice. She pressed the sandwich closed and took a bite anyway. But she'd already started listening to the part of herself that whispered something was wrong. Not just with the food, with the way nobody else noticed. The next day, the whisper became a scream. She peeled back the top layer of bread like her mother had told her. Eyes narrowed, breath held. The edges looked dry again, but something inside caught her attention. A murky green smear across the bottom slice, fuzzy and bloated like the underside of a forgotten fruit. Zaria's stomach lurched before she even touched it. She blinked, then looked again. It wasn't a spot. It wasn't dust. It was thick, live mold spreading from the meat into the bread, blooming beneath the turkey slices like a living bruise. Her hands moved on instinct, reaching into her backpack for the Ziploc bag she'd packed that morning just in case. She slipped the sandwich inside, trying to keep her face neutral as her classmates chatted around her. Her fingers were trembling as she zipped the seal. She had barely stuffed the bag into her pocket when the shadow of a navy apron loomed at her side. "What do you think you're doing?" came the voice, too sweet, too sudden. "Mrs. Langley." Zaria froze. She hadn't seen her coming. "You're not allowed to take food out of the cafeteria," the woman continued, louder this time so others would hear. "New rule, as of today. No outside food, and nothing leaves the lunchroom. That clear?" My mom said I should show her if something looks wrong." "Oh, I'm sure she did," Mrs. Langley said, her lips stretching into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But we can't have kids walking around with half-eaten sandwiches. Germs, you understand. Just throw it out." Zaria didn't move. Langley stepped closer, voice quiet but sharp as broken glass. "Now!" The girl's chest tightened. Her fingers still clutched the bag inside her hoodie pocket, pressed close against her stomach. She glanced around. The other lunch monitors weren't watching. Neither were the kids. She walked to the trash can, stood there. Then, slowly, deliberately, she pulled the Ziploc out and dropped it in. The soft thud of it landing against the paper plates and orange peels felt like a door closing. The rest of the day, her mind buzzed. She didn't eat dinner that night, and she barely spoke. Her mother noticed immediately. "You found something, didn't you?" Amara asked, leaning against the kitchen counter, arms folded. Zaria sat at the table, eyes fixed on the floor. There was mold inside the sandwich, green and hairy. "I tried to keep it, but that lady, Langley, she made me throw it out. She said it was a new rule. No food out of the cafeteria." Amara's jaw tightened. She pushed off the counter and reached for her phone. "Get your coat." Zaria didn't ask where they were going. She just followed. The school office was quiet, the lights dimmer than usual. A student worker at the front desk blinked in surprise when they entered. The office closes soon." "We'll be quick," Amara said smoothly. "I'm here to speak to the principal. Now." A few minutes later, Principal Harkness appeared from his office, his expression a polished mask of concern. "Mrs. Freeman, Zaria, good evening. Everything all right?" "No. My daughter has been getting sick from your cafeteria food for nearly a month now," Amara said, calm but firm. "And today she found mold. Not a little, a lot, inside her sandwich. When she tried to save it so I could see, your lunch staff forced her to throw it away and claimed there's a new policy banning students from keeping their food." Harkness nodded slowly, glancing at Zaria like she might confirm or deny it. I'm sorry to hear that, truly. But we haven't had any food-related complaints from other students. Not recently. She's not other students. She's mine, Amara said, eyes locked onto his. He paused, adjusted his tie. We take these concerns seriously. But unless you have the food in question or documentation of it, there's not much I can do at the moment. Zaria's hands balled into fists at her sides. She knew that tone. The careful, practiced way adults in power made kids feel like they were overreacting. The polite distance that meant nothing would happen. Her mother knew it too. So you're saying her word isn't enough? I'm saying we need evidence to act, he replied. With all due respect. They left without another word. At home, Zaria sat curled on the couch, her hoodie pulled over her knees, and listened as Amara paced the kitchen. They don't believe us. They don't want to, her mother said. So we're going to give them something they can't ignore. Zaria looked up. How? You're going to do what they're hoping you won't. You're going to keep eating the food. But this time, you're going to document everything. Photos, videos, timestamps. And you're going to be smart about it. No hiding things in your pocket. We'll get a phone case with a hidden lens if we have to. Zaria blinked, unsure whether to be nervous or proud. And if they come at you again, I'll be ready. But this time, we're not just going in there with a complaint. Her mom's voice steadied, low but electric. We're going in with proof. That night, Zaria lay awake, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling. Her stomach still hurt, but the feeling was different now. Less helpless, more like heat. A slow burn rising in her chest, fueled by the quiet certainty that someone had done this on purpose, that it wasn't a mistake, that she had been picked out. She wasn't just being neglected, she was being targeted. The next morning, Zaria tucked her phone inside the custom case her mother ordered online. It had a lens disguised as a decorative sticker, and a button on the side that triggered the camera without lighting the screen. Every move had to be quiet, every capture discreet. She didn't talk about it at school, she didn't joke about it online. She just documented, meal after meal, day after day. At first, it was small things. Bread that was slightly stale, fruit that looked overripe. Then, things became harder to explain away. A cluster of grapes with white fuzz blooming across the skin. A milk carton that hissed when opened and gave off a thick, sour stench. Banana slices in her fruit cup already browning into mush by second period. She took photos before each bite, her camera angled carefully so no one would see. Every tray, every meal, every close-up of molded crusts and slimy textures. Some of it she pretended to eat, slipping it into a Ziploc tucked in her backpack. Other times, she excused herself to the bathroom, where she documented in better lighting and flushed the rest. The odd part wasn't just the rot, it was the pattern. She started watching others. She saw the boy next to her in line receive a sandwich from the same tray. But his bread looked fluffy, his fruit firm and chilled. The girl behind her received a perfectly wrapped turkey wrap with crisp lettuce and dry corners. Zaria's sandwich that day was damp at the bottom, soggy enough to stain the napkin beneath it. One day, her tray had a milk carton with the label peeled off. She snapped a picture of it next to the others in the trash, all bearing the school's printed logo and date stamp. Hers didn't. When she opened it, a clot of cream-colored curd hit the inside of the lid and slid down the side like thick glue. She nearly gagged. That same afternoon, Aubrey Sinclair, Zaria's lab partner in science and occasional lunch table neighbor, noticed her pushing the food around again. "You always look like you're dissecting it," Aubrey joked, poking at her own applesauce. "Is that your thing now?" Zaria didn't look up. "I don't trust it." Aubrey made a face, then smirked. "Here, want to trade? I'm tired of this ham. You can have my peanut butter crackers." Zaria stiffened. "You sure?" "Totally. You're the one always watching your food like it's gonna jump at you." It happened before Zaria could say no. Aubrey slid her lunch over, snatched Zaria's tray, and took a huge bite of the sandwich, right through the center. For a few seconds, everything was fine. Then Aubrey froze, mouth still full. Her eyes narrowed. Ugh! What is that? Zarya leaned forward. Spit it out! Aubrey coughed, stumbled to her feet, and rushed toward the nearest trash bin. She retched, gasping and holding her stomach. Within an hour, she was in the nurse's office, pale, shaking, and nauseated. By the next period, she had been sent home. Zarya didn't need to ask what had happened. She already knew. By that evening, Amara was at the kitchen table again, flipping through the photolog Zarya had been compiling. She scrolled past images of souring yogurt, meat with a gray tinge, and trays where the food was clearly older than the date stamped on the packaging. She tapped her fingers against the wood. They can't say this is just your imagination anymore, she said. Someone else got sick. Her parents will raise hell. Zarya looked down. I didn't mean for her to get sick. I know you didn't, but you finally have a witness. They can't ignore that. But the school did. The next day, Zarya sat outside the nurse's office as her mother argued quietly with Principal Harkness. The door was open just enough to hear the conversation. She swapped lunches with my daughter and got violently sick, Amara said. Why hasn't the lunch staff been put under investigation? The food batch may have been spoiled, but there's no evidence of malice, Harkness replied coolly. It happens sometimes. Aubrey's parents were notified, and Mrs. Langley has been temporarily suspended while we assess the situation. Temporarily? You suspended her for a day. We reviewed the security footage. There's no indication she did anything out of the ordinary. You mean she didn't look racist on camera, so we're all supposed to forget it? Mrs. Freeman, Amara stepped back out, her face tight but calm. Let's go, Z. Zarya followed without a word. The rest of that week, she kept filming, even more carefully now. The food was still off, still different from what the other students got. But something new had shifted. Attention. A feeling of being watched. It was a Thursday when Mr. Bernal appeared beside her in the cafeteria. He wasn't carrying a mop or trash bin that day, just pushing a cart of clean trays. He moved quietly, as usual. She didn't even notice him until she heard him clear his throat softly beside her. She looked up. His eyes met hers, dark and careful. I saw what you've been doing, he said, voice low, barely audible beneath the cafeteria noise. Zarya froze. I've worked here 5 years, he continued, his voice like a whisper wrapped in gravel. You're not wrong, but be careful. They watch. Who? She asked, her throat dry. Bernal shook his head once. Just be careful what you catch, and who you trust. Then he pushed the cart forward and moved on, disappearing behind a line of loud 6th graders grabbing cookies. Zarya sat still for a long time, the sandwich on her tray untouched, her phone humming quietly in her pocket. Her fingers tightened around it, not in fear, but in quiet resolve. She hadn't imagined it. It wasn't in her head. Even the staff had seen something. The food wasn't the only thing being spoiled at her school. The silence around it was part of the design. The noise of the cafeteria faded into the background as Zarya stared ahead, her mind already moving faster than her body could follow. When the bell rang, she slipped out without touching her tray, careful not to draw attention, though the weight of her phone in her pocket felt heavier than ever. That evening, she didn't wait for her mother to ask. She walked straight into the living room, pulled out the Ziploc bags, scrolled through the week's photos, and laid her phone on the coffee table. I think I know where it's coming from, she said. Amara leaned forward. Show me. Zarya clicked through the images, the spoiled milk, the molded sandwich, the fruit with a white fuzz curling along its edge, and then paused on the photo from earlier that day. A lunch tray stamped with a code at the corner of the napkin, just barely visible. They're labeling the food. I think it's coded, like different meals for different kids. Amara stared, jaw tight. You're saying it's deliberate. I think someone's deciding who gets what. Zaria looked up, her voice steady. And Mr. Bernal? He knows something. He's scared. But he gave me a warning. There was a long silence, and then Amara nodded. We're done waiting. The next day, Zaria found him outside by the dumpster during cleanup, dragging a bin across the gravel. She didn't speak right away, just helped him pick up a crate of folded boxes that had tipped over. After a moment, he stood straight, wiping his hands on a rag. I have to show you something, she said. He didn't ask what. He just glanced around, and then nodded toward the back hallway. They moved quickly, quietly, weaving through the back corridor behind the gym and toward the rear of the kitchen. Mr. Bernal stopped at a heavy utility door with chipped paint and glanced over his shoulder. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket and pressed something into Zaria's hand. A silver key. I found it by accident a few months ago. Never told anyone. His eyes didn't meet hers. It's for the walk-in freezer, the one in the back. You didn't get this from me. And then he was gone again, lost behind another cart, his presence erased as easily as it had appeared. Zaria waited until the end of the lunch period, when the kitchen was nearly empty. She slipped through the staff door and walked calmly past the industrial sinks, the massive metal prep tables, and the racks of boxed deliveries. Her fingers clutched the key in her pocket. The air shifted as she neared the back freezer. A foul odor, faint at first, thickened as she approached. A putrid mix of mildew, spoiled meat, and something far worse. The door before her looked normal at a glance, but rust coiled along the hinges, and the paint near the handle had worn down to reveal scratches beneath. She slid the key into the lock. It clicked with a low groan. The door opened, and the smell hit her like a wave. She recoiled, one hand over her mouth, then forced herself inside. The light overhead was dim, barely illuminating the rows of plastic bins and containers stacked along the walls. Some were sealed, others were not. Zaria moved slowly, camera lens peeking from her hoodie string as it recorded everything. A crate of milk cartons sat against the far wall, their tops swollen, labels smudged. Beside them, meat packages oozed with congealed fluid, the color of rust and tar. She knelt beside a stack of bread loaves, some visibly green under the plastic, others collapsing inward like damp sponges. Every item was expired, some by days, others by months. But it wasn't just rot. Each bin was labeled in marker, symbols and letters she didn't recognize at first. One said X3, another said ST2, another simply B4. She flipped open a clipboard tucked behind a bin and found a list of matching codes with notes beside them. X3, experimental non-allergy. B4, brown students, 4th grade. ST2, secondary tray, no substitutions. At the bottom of the sheet, do not file. For internal use only. Zaria's pulse pounded in her ears. She backed away and turned, then saw the corkboard nailed to the wall behind a shelving unit. A torn curtain hung loosely in front of it. She pushed it aside. The board was covered in yellowed printouts and torn comic strips, each one crude, grotesque. Drawings of black and brown children with exaggerated features, captions like breadwinner and tray day for the zoo. And next to those cartoons, a handwritten list of names, nicknames, initials. Her name was there. A red check mark beside it. 7 in total. She stepped back, her phone still rolling, mouth dry. Then something on the floor caught her eye. An envelope, water-stained and crumpled, rested near a plastic tub of spoiled yogurt. She picked it up with a gloved hand and squinted at the label. Board copy. Return to superintendent subject. Discretionary food. Audit confidential. She tucked it inside her hoodie and turned back toward the freezer door, locking it behind her as she left. Mr. Bernal was gone. By the time she stepped into the hallway again, the bell had rung and the classrooms were shifting. Her feet felt far away from her body as she walked through the flow of students, her eyes locked ahead. Not running, not yet. But inside, she was on fire. That night, Zaria barely touched her food, her eyes distant, her thoughts still trapped in that freezer's stench. And when the table was cleared and the sink had gone quiet, she rose without a word, walked to the living room, and placed her phone on the table between them. With a calm that felt almost foreign, she opened the gallery, tapped the first video, and let it play without preamble, her voice low but firm as she said, "I got it." Amara didn't ask what she meant, didn't press for details or interrupt with the kind of protective questions that had always followed bad days. Instead, she simply sat beside her daughter, close enough for their shoulders to brush, and watched as the footage began to unfold in silence, the images casting a flickering glow across their faces. It was all there in unflinching clarity. The thick, pulsing mold swirled into the bread's flesh, the trays labeled in symbols that no child should be matched to, the cartoons that mocked their children's faces with cruel precision, and the list of names, with Zaria's marked again and again in angry red. The final image lingered longer than the rest. The envelope, dirt-smeared and water-warped, its stamped letters spelling out a truth no one in power had wanted uncovered. And when the screen went dark, the room held its breath with them until Amara finally exhaled, eyes still locked on the dim reflection of her own face in the black screen, and said in a voice that held no hesitation, "We're not taking this to the principal." Zaria met her gaze, without blinking, already knowing what came next, and when the words followed, quiet, sure, and burning with purpose, they felt like the start of something far larger. "We're taking this to the press." The morning after their decision, Amara made 3 phone calls before the sun had fully climbed over the rooftops. The first was to a local newsroom that had once published an article about cafeteria funding disparities in the district. The second was to a civil rights nonprofit that monitored discrimination in public schools. And the third, to a name she hadn't spoken in years, was to Nadine Cho, an investigative journalist who had once worked with her during a health outreach campaign in the city. Nadine remembered her instantly, and when Amara said, "I have something you need to see," the silence on the other end wasn't hesitation. It was focus. They met that same afternoon, not in the school or their home, but at a quiet corner table in a downtown coffee shop where the low jazz and clink of cups wouldn't interrupt what needed to be said. Zaria sat between them, her backpack zipped tight, the phone already charged, files already uploaded to an encrypted drive. Amara spoke first, laying out the pattern, the sickness, the silence, and finally the plan that led them to the freezer. She didn't try to dress it up or make it sound bigger than it was. She didn't have to. The footage spoke louder than any headline ever could. Nadine watched without blinking. She replayed the clip of the corkboard twice, her jaw tightening with each frame. And when the envelope was shown, creased and stamped with the superintendent's name, she whispered only one word, "Damning." By the time they finished, she was already texting her editor, her fingers moving with urgency, her voice low and full of heat as she said, "This won't just run. This will explode." And it did. The story broke online the next morning just after 7. Within hours, it was the top shared post on the site, picked up by regional outlets, and reposted by national watchdog accounts. The headline was direct, unapologetic, and impossible to ignore. Rotten food, racist system. A middle school feeding certain students spoiled lunches under secret codes. The images were blurred for privacy, but the captions weren't. Beneath each tray of food, each photo of mold, and the freeze frame of the corkboard were Zaria's words, "They told me it was just my stomach." The reaction was immediate and seismic. By mid-morning, a team from the Department of Public Health had arrived at the school, unannounced and armed with warrants. Students were pulled from the cafeteria, staff were told to clear the kitchen, and the main office shuttered its doors with the blinds drawn tight. Helicopters circled overhead. Reporters lined the sidewalks. Parents flooded the school's voicemail system, demanding explanations, apologies, and resignations. Mrs. Langley was not in the building when the inspectors arrived. She had called in sick. But within hours, a warrant was issued for her arrest, and when authorities reached her home, they found her backyard shed filled with additional materials, extra crates of expired supplies, handwritten notes, and copies of the same cartoon sketches posted in the school freezer. She was arrested on the spot, handcuffed while still in her robe, as cameras caught her shielding her face behind a manila envelope. But the shock hadn't even begun to settle when the second arrest came. Raymond Oglesby, the district food services supervisor, a man who had never been directly mentioned in the school's public handling of the matter, was detained at his office by federal agents. His name had surfaced in the files Zaria found, signatures on inspection waivers, emails directing complaints to legal, and notations marking repeated denials of audit requests. For years, he had redirected concerns, buried reports, and reassigned whistleblowers, all while assuring the public that the food program operated with state-compliant integrity. He had signed off on purchases that never arrived and had approved test batch exemptions used to shuffle rotten inventory away from white-majority schools and into facilities like Zaria's. The district released a prepared statement within hours, claiming full cooperation with the investigation and asserting that Oglesby's actions did not reflect the values of our educational system. But no one was listening to their values anymore. They were too busy watching what came next, because even as the headlines screamed and the arrests multiplied, another voice entered the spotlight, this time from within Mrs. Langley's own bloodline. Her niece, Marissa Langley, a sophomore at State College and former volunteer at the school 2 years earlier, posted a thread online that shattered whatever defenses the district hoped to raise. She included screenshots of text messages, group chat logs, and voice memos, messages her aunt had sent, laughing about how a little mold never killed anyone worth remembering, and referring to students by names like Brown Tray Baby and Snack Duty Reject. In one voice clip, Langley could be heard saying, "I don't care what their parents say. Those kids get what they deserve. You feed animals. You don't plate them like guests." Marissa's post began with a single sentence. "I told her to stop. She didn't listen. And now I won't stay quiet." The screenshots went viral in less than an hour. National reporters picked up the story by the afternoon, and civil rights attorneys began appearing on every major news network, citing precedent, intent, and patterns of systemic neglect. What had once been a quiet pain in a middle school lunchroom was now a national firestorm, igniting conversations about race, public education, food equity, and the quiet cruelty of institutional silence. And in the center of it all was a 13-year-old girl who had simply stopped ignoring the pain in her stomach. The school auditorium hadn't been filled like this in years. The folding chairs, usually reserved for spring concerts and budget meetings, now packed the room from wall to wall. Rows of parents stood along the sides and spilled into the hall, murmuring anxiously while camera crews positioned their tripods near the back, cables stretching across the linoleum like veins beneath a brittle surface. It was not an ordinary forum. It was a reckoning. On stage, the school board members sat in a stiff line behind a table too small for the magnitude of the evening, their expressions ranging from forced professionalism to barely masked discomfort. Superintendent Halverston, a man whose face had appeared on community flyers for years, with slogans like "Together in Trust," stood at the podium, hands gripping its sides like it was the only solid thing left in the room. Amara sat in the second row, her eyes locked on him, not with fury, but with focus. the kind of steady resolve that made excuses feel thinner before they were even spoken. Zaria was beside her, back straight, silent. Around them, voices buzzed, families trading names, whispering dates, comparing stories that no one had thought to connect until now. Before the superintendent could begin his prepared statement, a mother 3 rows back rose from her seat, her voice cutting through the air with a clarity that silenced the room. She held a folder in one hand, shaking slightly, and spoke with the urgency of someone who had waited too long to be heard. "My daughter," she began, "is in 8th grade now. But when she was in 6th, she came home 3 times with stomach pain after eating school lunch. I reported it. I sent emails. I even brought in the fruit she was given. Blueberries with a thick white fuzz coating the inside of the cup. You know what your office said?" She opened the folder, pulling out a printed reply. It said, "We're sorry to hear of your concerns. Rest assured our cafeteria meets state guidelines." Nothing changed. More voices followed. A father stood and described how his son had been taken to urgent care twice, with stomach cramps and vomiting, both times after days when, in hindsight, the food had smelled strange. A grandmother recounted how her grandson, who had since transferred to another district, refused to eat lunch at school and had been called dramatic for doing so. Each story came with dates, photos, names of teachers, and now, thanks to Zaria's recordings, a context that made them impossible to dismiss. Then came the voice that shifted the air entirely. A tall, soft-spoken woman in her early 40s, wearing an old cafeteria uniform beneath her blazer, stepped onto the aisle with a folded paper in hand. She waited until the crowd hushed itself, and when she reached the microphone positioned near the base of the stage, she didn't introduce herself. She unfolded the paper with deliberate care, then began to read. "My name is Renee Clark. I worked in the Jefferson Middle School cafeteria from 2016 until 2022. I am no longer employed with the district, not because I resigned, but because I raised concerns and was reassigned until my hours were cut, and my position was eliminated. In 2021, I filed a report with Principal Harkness regarding expired food being rotated back into daily meals. I also expressed concern that only certain students seem to be receiving those trays, primarily Black and Latino students. A collective shift moved through the audience like a ripple. My report included photographs and written logs. It was handed directly to Principal Harkness in a sealed envelope. 2 days later, I was told that no further action would be taken and that I should let the legal team do their job. I was advised not to bring it up again. I was told that stirring panic over food safety could lead to unnecessary legal scrutiny and harm our district's image. I was told to remember how hard it was to find cafeteria jobs. I was told to choose silence. She looked up from the paper, her voice trembling but not weak. I did not know how deep it went. I did not know about the cartoons. I did not know about the names on the wall. But I knew something was wrong, and I was told to stop asking questions. I stand here now to say I was complicit in that silence. I can't undo what was ignored, but I will not let my silence protect this system any longer. The room didn't erupt. It didn't have to. The weight of her words settled like smoke, heavy, slow, inescapable. From his position at the podium, Superintendent Halverston adjusted his tie, his eyes scanning the crowd now filled with not just anger, but names, memories, and evidence he could no longer deflect. He opened his mouth to speak, but Amara rose before he could, her voice level, strong. "You knew. Maybe not in detail, maybe not from day one, but enough. You knew something was wrong. You let this happen in the name of protecting a building instead of the children inside it." He tried to respond, stumbling through phrases like institutional oversight and systemic failure, but the audience wasn't listening anymore. The power had shifted. The silence had cracked wide open. That night, As Zaria and Amara walked back to the car, passing reporters scribbling notes and families embracing in the parking lot, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. What had once been dismissed as a stomachache had become a fire no one could smother. And the people responsible weren't just on the kitchen floor. They were in offices, behind podiums, buried in the folds of a system that had mistaken silence for safety. 2 days after the town forum, the Freeman home phone rang at 7:14 in the morning. Unusual even by the standards of their now chaotic lives. Amara answered, half-dressed for work, expecting another reporter or another parent seeking guidance. But the voice on the other end was crisp, practiced, and unmistakably strained with discomfort. "This is Evelyn Sinclair," the woman said. "Aubrey's mother." Amara straightened. "Yes? I just wanted to say, we've seen the footage, the whole thing, not just the news clips. A friend sent us the full video your daughter recorded in the freezer. My husband and I didn't know it was that bad. We thought it was just food mishandling, something you could chalk up to poor training, maybe outdated refrigeration. But what your daughter uncovered is—" She paused, her breath hitching faintly. "It's evil," she said, voice low now. "That's what it is. What happened to Zaria, to the others, and to Aubrey? I can't believe we let it slide." Amara didn't respond right away. She had learned, over the past weeks, that silence could sometimes speak more than anger. "We're drafting a letter to the board today," Evelyn continued, "demanding that every current member step down. And unless they do, Aubrey's being pulled from Jefferson immediately. We've already spoken to her new school." Amara closed her eyes for a moment and exhaled quietly. "Thank you. We should have spoken up sooner," Evelyn whispered. "But we're speaking now." By noon, the Sinclairs' letter had reached every inbox at the district office, and by evening it had been published in 3 different regional outlets. It wasn't just an angry parent complaint, it was a meticulously written condemnation, backed by screenshots, legal references, and a copy of their daughter's medical report. The closing line read, "If you are unwilling to resign in the face of this evidence, then you were never fit to govern children in the first place." The board panicked. Within 24 hours, a new town hall was announced, televised, public, and intended as a space for healing and accountability. The auditorium was packed even tighter than before, only now national news outlets had set up on both sides of the aisle. Zaria sat backstage, her fingers brushing the folded sheet of paper in her lap. It wasn't a speech, just a few lines she had written the night before while staring at the glow of her nightlight, unable to sleep. When her name was called, she stepped out slowly, not nervous, but grounded in the moment. The crowd quieted immediately. She stood behind the podium, the mic too tall, and cleared her throat once. "I was told it was all in my head," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I was told I was too sensitive, that the food was safe, that I needed to stop asking questions. But my stomach didn't lie to me, and neither did the mold in my sandwich. Neither did the other kids who got sick. Neither did the names on that wall." A quiet settled like snowfall. "I'm not here because I want to be famous. I'm here because I don't want anyone else to go through what I did. I want schools to feed kids, not punish them with food. I want people to look at someone like me and believe them the first time." She paused, glancing out across the room filled with hundreds of faces and flickering camera lights. "If I didn't speak up, I'd still be sick, and they'd still be getting away with it." When she stepped down, the applause didn't come in a burst. It rolled forward slowly, steadily, rising from the students, then the parents, then the reporters who had watched a middle school girl turn a private pain into a public demand for justice. By the end of the week, an anonymous donation, signed only with the initials TF, launched the Zaria Freeman Resilience Fund, a scholarship to support students who report institutional neglect or abuse in public schools. The fund was announced live on air, the camera catching Zaria's stunned face as Amara reached for her hand and squeezed it tight. But even in that moment of hope, another injustice rippled beneath the surface. Mr. Bernal was gone. He had not returned to work since the health inspection. His name was no longer listed on the school's website. His badge deactivated. No warning, no announcement, no appreciation. Just a quiet erasure. Zaria found out from a custodian who whispered it while stacking chairs after the assembly. They said it was budget-related, he muttered. But we all know why. That night, Zaria sat across from her mother, her jaw tight. He helped me. He didn't have to. And now he's being punished. Amara nodded, already dialing a number she hadn't used in years. The office of Marisol Green, a civil rights attorney she'd once marched beside during a hospital equity protest. Within days, Green had signed on to represent Mr. Bernal pro bono, citing wrongful termination, retaliation, and witness intimidation. And Bernal, who had remained quiet through every shift and every slight, gave his first public statement. "I didn't speak because I was afraid," he said, "but I helped Zaria because she was braver than the rest of us. I'm not going to let that bravery be punished in silence." The district tried to claim procedural necessity. The media called it what it was, retaliation. And the people, those who had once looked away, once said nothing, finally refused to stay silent. The news vans never left. What had started as a localized scandal had evolved into something far larger. No longer just a case of cafeteria misconduct, but the unraveling of a systemic failure that touched every floor of the district's administration building. In the weeks following Zaria's public statement and the legal filing on Mr. Bernal's behalf, the number of families stepping forward doubled, then tripled. With every passing day, more stories emerged, not all as severe as Zaria's, but each revealing a clear pattern of exclusion, neglect, and deliberate silence. Some accounts came from former students now in high school or beyond, remembering years-old stomach cramps they were told were just anxiety. Others came from parents who had questioned spoiled food or erratic tray substitutions and were told, gently and firmly, to stop making trouble. A few came with paper trails, emails unanswered, forms ignored, requests for dietary accommodations that vanished into administrative voids. The accumulation of complaints became too dense to ignore. Lawsuits poured in. Civil rights attorneys formed coalitions. Advocacy groups launched petitions calling for federal oversight. Class action suits began forming, not only against Jefferson Middle School, but against the district leadership itself. Amara's phone rarely stopped ringing now, no longer with doubts or dismissals, but with legal inquiries, policy suggestions, and invitations to join parent-led reform boards. And then the Department of Justice stepped in. The announcement arrived in the form of a short but sharp press conference held on the courthouse steps, flanked by federal agents and an official from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. An investigation had been opened, and not just into the handling of food, but into hate crimes. Zaria sat on the couch beside Amara when the segment aired, her knees drawn to her chest, her hand resting lightly on the remote. Neither spoke, as the agent stated clearly. This case reflects a possible violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. There is evidence that students were deliberately targeted based on race and ethnicity through practices that were known, concealed, and perpetuated by public officials. The footage cut to a photo of the corkboard Zaria had captured. The blurred faces, the check marks, the drawings. That was when the next layer cracked open. A reporter from a regional outlet, following a lead buried in one of Zaria's videos, began digging into the school's financial records. With assistance from a whistleblower inside the district's accounting office, she uncovered a disturbing paper trail. Over the past 5 years, the school had received nearly $600,000 in state grants intended for kitchen modernization, and food safety compliance. According to the documents, that money had been fully spent on equipment upgrades, safety training, and infrastructure repair. But none of those things had occurred. The refrigerator that failed inspection had been in place for over a decade. The training sessions listed in the logs had been canceled or never scheduled, and the food prep equipment Zaria had photographed was visibly outdated. What the documents did show, however, were purchase orders for generic line items, paper goods, janitorial supplies, bulk storage bins, filed and signed by the same two people every time. Raymond Oglesby, the former food services supervisor now under indictment, and Principal Harkness. Zaria's footage included glimpses of order logs taped inside the freezer, pages that should have been logged in the central record but weren't. The codes scribbled on the boxes matched the items listed in the false purchase orders. It was enough to suggest not just mismanagement, but outright fraud. The diverted funds hadn't just vanished. They had been laundered through fake purchases and buried in meaningless categories, all while students were being served food that made them sick. The final nail came when the warrant for Mrs. Langley's property was executed. It happened just before sunrise. Agents arrived with a search team and cameras close behind. The footage showed boxes being carried out, papers sealed in evidence bags, and storage tubs labeled "Kitchen Files, Personal." At first, the contents seemed mundane: expired calendars, tattered recipe sheets, and outdated training manuals. But within one of the boxes, agents found a black binder marked "Log, Priority Rotations." Inside were detailed records, organized by date and initials, noting which trays had been modified, which students had reacted, and which names had been flagged for observation. It wasn't just neglect. It was methodical, calculated, a personal record of inflicted harm kept like a trophy journal. Worse still, beneath that binder was an old shoebox, taped shut. Inside were photographs, printed on glossy paper, labeled by hand. Snapshots of food trays with visible mold, spoiled fruit, milk cartons with warning stickers peeled away. Each photo was captioned, "Repeat whiner. Didn't eat today. Weak stomach. Third strike. Let's see how she handles X3. There were dozens. Also recovered were notebooks filled with hateful diatribes, racist jokes, slurs, and hand-drawn caricatures that mirrored those pinned to the corkboard in the freezer. One particularly disturbing entry read, "They won't learn respect in class, so they'll learn it from hunger. They'll remember my food." The photos were never meant to be seen by anyone else, but now they became exhibits in a federal case. That evening, Amara received a call from Nadine Cho, the investigative journalist who had broken the original story. Her voice was calm, almost stunned. "They found everything," she said. "Every document, every lie, every name. Your daughter didn't just start a movement, she unearthed a legacy, and it's about to fall apart." Amara glanced at Zaria, curled up on the couch beneath a blanket, headphones around her neck, sketching quietly in the pages of her notebook. Not drawing cartoons this time, but vines and light beams and hands reaching upward from the soil. She didn't interrupt. She just whispered, "Let it fall." When the official summons arrived in the mail, the envelope bore the seal of the State Board of Education and a short, formal invitation requesting Zaria's presence at an upcoming hearing regarding systemic oversight and food safety standards in public schools. Amara read it twice before passing it to her daughter, who took it with calm fingers and a quiet nod. There was no need for discussion. They both knew this moment had been building since the first day Zaria came home clutching her stomach. The hearing room was larger than any space Zaria had ever spoken in, but it didn't intimidate her. Rows of public officials, educators, and state legislators lined the long chamber, their attention fixed on the podium at the front. Behind them, dozens of parents, students, and members of the press filled every seat. Yet in all the noise, It was the silence between each voice that carried the weight of what had been done. When Zaria stepped forward to testify, there were no cue cards, no script, no speech prepared in the traditional sense. She had written her thoughts the night before in the margins of her notebook, between sketches of dandelions breaking through concrete, but she didn't need to read them to know what she wanted to say. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't need to rise or demand. It simply spoke the truth, with the quiet clarity of someone who had already lived the cost of being ignored. "I was told my stomach pain was in my head," she began. "I was told I needed to toughen up, eat what I was given, stop complaining. But what I was given was spoiled, was dangerous, and it wasn't just a mistake. It happened again and again, and when I tried to speak up, they made new rules to keep me quiet." The panel shifted, some nodding slowly, others scribbling notes, but no one interrupted. I didn't know what I'd find when I started taking pictures. I just wanted someone to believe me. But what I found was bigger than just bad food. I found proof that certain kids who looked like me, were being treated differently. And the people who could have stopped it didn't. Not because they didn't know, but because they didn't want to see. She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. "I'm not here to make anyone feel better. I'm here because no student should ever feel like they're being poisoned for existing. I'm here because silence almost let this go unseen. I'm here because I wasn't the only one. And I won't be the last if nothing changes." When she stepped back from the podium, the applause was subdued but undeniable. Not loud, not for show, but heavy with respect. Then Amara took the floor. She didn't waste time with pleasantries or acknowledgments. She stood tall, her voice low and firm, eyes locked onto the people who had the power to make decisions, but had failed to protect the children those decisions affected. "My daughter came home sick for weeks," she said. "And every time, I told myself, maybe it was just something in the air. Maybe it was just bad luck. Maybe the school was just too busy to care. But deep down, I knew better. I knew something was wrong. And when I asked for help, when I begged for accountability, I was met with nods and hollow assurances that didn't mean anything." She held up a folder, not with legal documents, but with the printed photos Zaria had taken. She opened it and turned it to the board, letting them see the same mold, the same discolored fruit, the same stamped codes that had triggered so much pain. "This isn't about budget shortages. This isn't about clerical mistakes. This was targeted, and it was allowed to happen because the people at the top were more afraid of bad headlines than bad food. You want to know what I felt as a mother? Helpless, until I realized I had to stop waiting for permission to fight." Her testimony didn't end with tears. It ended with a promise that no other child would ever sit in silence again if she had anything to do with it. Within days, the fallout was swift and sweeping. The district's top leadership, Superintendent Halverston, Principal Harkness, and the regional compliance manager, were removed from their posts by state order. The board voted unanimously to restructure oversight roles and permanently dissolve the internal audit team that had once been responsible for clearing cafeteria inspections with falsified documentation. But more than firings and firmer rules, the board passed a resolution to support a new legislative bill introduced with Zaria's name attached in the opening line, the Freeman Accountability and Transparency Act. The proposed law mandated real-time cafeteria audits, required public release of all food inspection reports, and established a student-led oversight council in every district. More importantly, it created legal protection for student and staff whistleblowers, ensuring no one would be punished again for telling the truth. Yet just as the state reform bill began its journey through committee review, a final, powerful piece of evidence emerged. A retired sixth-grade science teacher named Lena Rhodes, who had quietly left the district the year before, reached out to the investigative team. For months, She had suspected something was wrong in the cafeteria after witnessing strange behavior during her lunch duty rotations. But after reporting it internally and being warned to drop it or be reassigned, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She had placed a discreet camera, hidden inside a faculty cabinet adjacent to the kitchen entrance, recording hours of cafeteria activity during lunch prep and cleanup. When the footage was recovered, it confirmed everything. The videos captured staff sorting trays by coded letters, separating food with visible differences in freshness and appearance, and whispering about which students were on rotation. It showed Mrs. Langley inspecting food with a clipboard, scribbling marks beside names, and laughing as she passed a tray to a student with a muttered remark caught just loud enough on the audio. "Another for X3. Let's see how long she lasts." The camera had sat quietly, documenting the truth long before Zaria's first photo, long before the envelope, long before the nation knew Jefferson Middle's name. Now, it joined the evidence as the final confirmation, unfiltered, undeniable, and immune to manipulation. The silence that had once shielded the harm was gone, and in its place stood the echo of truth, finally heard. By the time the new semester began, Jefferson Middle School had been transformed almost beyond recognition. The cafeteria's gleaming stainless steel counters and brightly lit serving line stood in stark contrast to the dim, rotten storage room Zaria had first discovered. Walls, once scrawled with coded slurs, now bore vibrant student-designed murals celebrating unity and respect, each plaque signed by someone who had fought to bring the truth to light. Under the Policy Institute's freshly installed by state mandate, every meal was photographed before leaving the kitchen. Transparency kiosks in the hallway displayed daily inspection reports, and anonymous tip boxes, lined with pamphlets explaining students' rights, were scattered at every entrance. Even the menus were posted in multiple languages, an acknowledgement that every child, regardless of background, deserved dignity at every meal. Mr. Strul. Bernal returned quietly, as if stepping back into a community he had never really left, walking the halls in his new role on the Cafeteria Oversight Council with an air of solemn responsibility. Under federal protection, he reviewed every delivery, trained staff on proper food handling, and offered support to any student who raised a concern, even if that concern seemed small. In classrooms across the building, teachers paused during announcements to remind students that courage could change systems, and Zaria's name appeared as part of a permanent plaque in the main foyer, for bravery in exposing rot, deceit, and hate, and for reminding us that truth is nourishment. Letters poured in from across the country, handwritten notes on lined paper, illustrated postcards from places Zaria had never heard of, and typed emails forwarded by neighbors and school librarians. Each carried a simple message: gratitude for refusing to be silent, admiration for standing up when adults failed, and the promise that they, too, would speak out if they saw injustice. Zaria read them all with quiet wonder, tucking the most colorful into her sketchbook so that the voices of strangers became a chorus beneath every pencil stroke. Meanwhile, the legal case against Mrs. Langley advanced through the courts with an intensity that matched the fury of the public's outrage. She was formally indicted on multiple counts, endangering the welfare of minors, falsifying official records, and committing hate crimes motivated by racial animus, all charges that carried the possibility of decades behind bars. Prosecutors laid out the evidence in courtroom exhibits: pages from her own trophy binders, photographs of the corkboard cartoons, and the testimony of dozens of victims and whistleblowers who had once been dismissed as troublemakers. But the final, and perhaps most chilling, revelation came from a lab report that forensic experts testified to under oath. One early sandwich sample, pulled from safe storage and subjected to a full chemical analysis, contained traces of benzalkonium chloride, an industrial disinfectant never approved for food use. Further tests uncovered residual traces of quaternary ammonium compounds in several batches of fruit and milk that Zaria had documented, conclusively proving that the contamination had not been accidental nor confined to natural mold, but the result of deliberate chemical treatment. With that finding, the charges against Langley escalated to include conspiracy to poison, reckless endangerment through chemical exposure, and a new count of aggravated hate crime based on the targeted nature of the compound's distribution. In the hush that followed the announcement, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. No procedural murmur, no shuffling of papers, just the weight of a truth too terrible for words. Mrs. Langley herself looked smaller, her carefully maintained composure crumbling under the gravity of her own concoctions. Her once feigned charm and stern warning about germs had been exposed as a facade for a calculated campaign of harm against children of color. The judge adjourned for recess, but the echo of that chemical proof would resonate long after the gavel fell. A final confirmation that justice had finally caught up with deliberate cruelty. And as Zaria and Amara left the courthouse side by side, hands clasped, they did not speak. They didn't need to. In the bright sunlight of that March afternoon, they carried with them the knowledge that a system bent on erasure had been dismantled by a single girl's refusal to stay silent, and that every name, every photo, and every drop of poison she unearthed had become a catalyst for real, lasting change. The morning sunlight slanted through the high courtroom windows, illuminating the rows of benches where families, community members, and reporters gathered in anticipation. Judge Marisa Caldwell presided over the chamber with the calm authority of someone who had seen countless cases, yet her gaze seemed to soften as she regarded the 13-year-old girl in the front row, Zaria Freeman, whose quiet courage had already changed a district. Bailiffs guided Mrs. Langley to the defendant's table, where she sat flanked by her defense team. The air felt charged, as though every person present understood the gravity of what was at stake, far more than the fate of one lunch lady, but the question of whether a system that could permit such willful cruelty would be held to account. When the judge called the trial to order, her gavel tapped twice against the wood, resonating like a heartbeat in the hushed room. "Will the defendant please rise?" she said. Mrs. Langley, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun and her posture rigid, stood as defense attorney Mark Rendell spoke in measured tones. "My client pleads not guilty to all charges." A ripple ran through the gallery, followed by an intake of breath, as those who had followed each indictment counted the echoes. Endangering the welfare of minors, falsifying official documents, hate crimes, conspiracy to poison. Prosecutor Diane Cho rose next, her expression resolute, her notes neatly arranged on the lectern before her. She began by reminding the jury of their solemn duty to consider evidence without prejudice, then turned to exhibits that glowed with unambiguous clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice firm but compassionate, "this case is not about a single incident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It is about a pattern of deliberate cruelty, directed at children who deserved protection, not poison." As she spoke, courtroom technician Allison Park dimmed the overhead lights and projected the first slide onto a screen behind the jury. A close-up photograph of a turkey sandwich, its bread layers swollen with fuzzy green mold. Cho clicked the remote. Exhibit 12. Photographs taken by Zaria Freeman on March 2, 2025, showing condemned food items that were served repeatedly to targeted students. The images flickered in sequence: mottled fruit cups, milk cartons smeared with curd, bread streaked with stains, and the jurors leaned forward, eyes narrowing as they absorbed the visual proof. Cho continued, "But mold alone does not constitute a hate crime or deliberate endangerment. It is the context in which these items were served that transforms negligence into malice." She advanced to the next slide, a photograph of the freezer corkboard, pinned with grotesque caricatures and a handwritten list of names, each accompanied by red check marks. The cartoons, crude in execution, yet unmistakable in intent, depicted children of color as animals or pests. A murmur rippled through the courtroom before Cho silenced it with a nod. Exhibit 27 is the freezer evidence from that same shipment. Behind these doors unlocked only with a key found in the possession of the defendant, lay crates of food designated by coded labels. ST2 marked for standard secondary trays, B4 for brown students in 4th grade, and X3 for experimental non-allergy batches. Each code corresponded to a group of children whom Mrs. Langley singled out for cruel treatment. The screen shifted to a close-up of those coded containers, the faded ink of the markers and the rotted corners of the packaging uncomfortably vivid. As the prosecutor detailed the falsified state audit reports and purchase orders bearing Mrs. Langley's signature, the defense attorney rose. Rendell's challenge was polite but determined. "These photographs and documents," he said, voice pitched low, "are circumstantial. They show mold and correspondence, but they do not prove intent. My client's actions, while perhaps misguided, lacked the criminal intent required for these charges. She is a lunch lady, not a technician or chemist. If there were disinfectant residues on the bread, it was the result of improper cleaning procedures, not a calculated attempt to harm." He paused, scanning the jury. "We ask you to remember that mistakes, not malice, are at issue here." Prosecutor Cho allowed a respectful nod before calling her critical witness, Mr. Carlos Bernal, the custodian who had risked his name and livelihood to help Zaria. Under federal protection, he was sworn in, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He described, in clear, unbroken sentences, how he had found Mrs. Langley's secret logs, how he had witnessed coded sorting of food trays, and how he had provided Zaria with the key to the freezer. When asked to explain what he saw on the corkboard, he did not flinch. "The cartoons," he said, "were not innocent drawings. They were targets. I saw her check the list when she thought nobody was watching. She counted them like trophies." His gaze flicked momentarily toward the defendant, whose face had gone pale. Zaria sat rigidly through his testimony, her eyes fixed on the witness stand. Even at 13, she understood the power of bearing witness. When Mr. Bernal concluded and stepped down, she offered him a nod that said more than words could. The room felt heavier, as though relief and sorrow had fused in a single breath. Cho then presented the final, most damning exhibit, the chemical analysis report confirming traces of benzalkonium chloride and quaternary ammonium compounds deliberately applied to the bread and fruit. The lab determined, she explained, that these disinfectants could not have arrived there by accident. They had to be added before packaging or during preparation under direct supervision. She pointed to a chart overlaying ingestion timelines with recorded illness episodes among targeted students. "This is the pattern of poisoning we alleged." At that point, defense counsel attempted to introduce doubt about chain of custody. But the court's ruling underscored the meticulous documentation by forensic teams, from sealed evidence bags to time-stamped video recordings. With the chemical report verified under oath by a toxicologist from the Department of Health, the jury had no room left for plausible deniability. As the day wore on and witnesses were cross-examined, the atmosphere in the courtroom remained sober and focused. The jurors were carefully guided through every detail, from the logging of purchase orders to the covert camera footage supplied by Ms. Rhodes, the former teacher whose hidden device corroborated Zaria's own recordings. By late afternoon, when Judge Caldwell recessed for the day, even the most reticent members of the community had come to understand the full scope of what had transpired behind Jefferson Middle's cafeteria doors. That evening, as Zaria and Amara left the courthouse, The teenager carried herself not with bravado, but with the stillness of someone who had fulfilled her role in a story much larger than herself. The trial would continue for days, but the turning point, the moment when evidence transcended argument, had already passed. In the quiet that followed, Judge Caldwell's words lingered in the hallways. Justice is not only served by verdicts, it is served by truth spoken in full. And in that truth, Zaria had found her voice, and made sure the world could no longer look away. By the third week of testimony, the courtroom had grown accustomed to the cadence of sorrow and outrage that so often accompanies the uncovering of deep injustice. Witnesses arrived in succession. A pediatric gastroenterologist who explained how repeated exposure to benzalkonium chloride could cause chronic inflammation, deep ulcerations, and lasting digestive disorders in children. A food safety auditor whose own reputation had been compromised by the falsified reports, and even a former cafeteria aide who braved retaliation to recount late-night phone calls from Mrs. Langley, demanding assurances that no further complaints would surface. One of the most harrowing moments came when Mrs. Sinclair, Aubrey's mother, took the stand. Her voice quivered only briefly, just long enough to remind everyone that horror sometimes speaks through tears. She described how her young daughter, once bubbly and bright, had retreated into silence, haunted by stomach aches she couldn't explain, and by the fear that every lunchtime carried a new threat. With her hand resting on her daughter's back, Aubrey sat in the front row, shoulders tense. Mrs. Sinclair held up a uniform milk carton, the top swollen and cracked, and said, "I kept this in my freezer for months, just to prove it happened." The small, sallow carton became tangible evidence of terror inflicted upon the innocent. Between witness testimonies, defense attorney Rendell attempted to weave doubt, suggesting that lapses in chain of custody, unintentional errors, and the stress of pandemic-fueled food shortages had created a perfect storm of mistakes. He proclaimed repeatedly that while Mr. Oglesby and Mrs. Langley might have overseen poor kitchen conditions, there was no direct proof that she had meant to poison any child. Yet each time he spoke, the prosecutor responded with one carefully chosen exhibit after another. Zaria's initial photos, the hidden camera footage, the chemical analyses, and the handwritten logs in Mrs. Langley's own ink. Judge Caldwell maintained order during objections and motions, her rulings affirming that the overwhelming weight of evidence transcended any mere technicality. She reminded the jury that intent could be drawn from actions and results, not only from confessions or explicit statements. When a person in power deliberately conceals evidence of wrongdoing, she said, and then compounds that wrongdoing with attempts to evade accountability, the law must address not just the harm done, but the will behind it. Midway through the final week, the prosecution called its last witness, Dr. Elena Rossi, an expert in sociocultural studies of discrimination. She explained how symbolic violence, like the racist cartoons and coded labeling, served to dehumanize targeted groups and pave the way for actual physical harm. She spoke softly but firmly, weaving statistics and personal narratives into a tapestry that linked everyday cruelty to broader patterns of hate. When bigotry is allowed to masquerade as policy, she concluded, it becomes a force that wounds bodies as surely as it wounds spirits. After Dr. Rossi's testimony, the court recessed for a day to allow both sides to prepare closing arguments. In the prosecution's final summation, Diane Cho stood before the jury with a quiet intensity, methodically revisiting each count, endangering the welfare of minors through chemical poisoning, falsifying official documents to conceal malfeasance, and committing hate crimes born of racial animus. She paused at each element, letting her words hang as if carved in stone. We do not accuse Mrs. Langley of being merely negligent. We accuse her of premeditated cruelty masked as caregiving. She closed by looking out at Zaria and Amara, adding, "Let this verdict speak for those whose voices were poisoned until they could no longer speak for themselves. Rendell's closing argument sought compassion, urging the jury to consider whether remorse and career ruin were punishment enough. He begged them to see the woman he portrayed as someone who lost her way rather than a calculated predator. Yet as he spoke, every handwritten note he waved seemed to underscore the very meticulous planning the prosecution had shown. Schedules of menu substitutions, logs of chemical purchases, personal notes about which children deserved the harder tray. When the judge delivered her final instructions, she reminded the jury that moral outrage, while powerful, must find its final expression in the impartial application of law. "Your verdict must reflect the facts and the evidence alone," she said. Then she sent them to deliberate. The jury's deliberations spanned 2 days, during which the hush in the courthouse was palpable. Reporters gathered near the chamber doors, their phones pressed for updates. Families paced the hallways, exchanging prayerful glances. Zaria returned to her sketchbook, attempting to draw something that mirrored her hope rather than her trauma. Dandelion seeds carried on the wind, scattering toward open skies. When the jury finally filed back into the courtroom, all eyes turned to the forewoman, a woman in her 50s, who carried herself with a quiet dignity. Judge Caldwell invited her to read the verdict. The forewoman unfolded the paper, looked up, and announced each count in measured tones. On count 1, endangering the welfare of minors, guilty. On count 2, falsifying public records, guilty. On count 3, hate crimes based on race, guilty. On count 4, conspiracy to poison, guilty. A collective exhale swept across the room. Families embraced, reporters scribbled furiously, and even some of Mrs. Langley's former supporters in the back benches stood in stunned acknowledgement. The defense table sat motionless, faces pale beneath carefully applied makeup, while the prosecutor allowed herself the barest nod of satisfaction. Mrs. Langley's attorney rose immediately to request a sentencing hearing, his voice uncertain now, as if the ground had shifted beneath him. But the momentum of justice was unstoppable. In the following weeks, sentencing papers were filed, and the judge imposed a federal prison term of 15 years, classification as a hate criminal ensuring strict supervision upon release, and mandated restitution to compensate the victims and fund community programs combating school-based discrimination. On the day of sentencing, as Mrs. Langley was led away in handcuffs, Zaria watched from the front row, her mother's hand in hers. There were no triumphant shouts, no exaggerated displays of victory, only a quiet resolution that justice had not only been done, but heard and felt. In the hush of the courtroom, her final thought was not of retribution, but of renewal, that the courage of a single child could awaken the conscience of an entire system, and that truth, once spoken aloud, could never again be buried in silence. By the time spring rolled around, the hallways of Jefferson Middle School were alive with color and purpose in a way they had never been before. Where once the walls echoed with hushed worry and avoided glances, now students gathered each morning beneath a vast mural co-created by art classes and community volunteers. Its sweeping design featured interlaced hands of every hue stretching upward, blossoms emerging from shattered plates, and banners woven with words like voice, safety, and justice. Beneath that tapestry of paint, a brass plaque bore a single inscription, in honor of those who refused to be silent. On the first day the mural was unveiled, the entire school gathered on the courtyard lawn. Zaria stood at the front, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, watching as her classmates and neighbors traced fingers along the hands painted on the wall. Some smiled with recognition, seeing their own faces in the patterns woven across the brick, while others wiped away tears as they read the names of students who had spoken up. The principal of the new state-appointed board, herself a former teacher selected for her integrity, spoke with a warmth that acknowledged both sorrow and hope. "This mural reminds us that courage grows from community," she said. "May it stand as our promise. We will protect every child's right to be seen, heard, and fed with dignity." That same morning, Zaria received an email announcing that her essay, "When Silence Spoils," had won a national contest overseen by the Education Equity Foundation. The judges praised her ability to transform personal pain into a universal call for change, noting especially how she had navigated her narrative with both vulnerability and strength. The award came with a scholarship and the promise that her words would be published in a leading teaching journal. When she shared the news with Amara, her mother's eyes brimmed with pride, sharpened by relief, and the two embraced in the back of the auditorium, the press pool capturing the moment like sunlight through spring blossoms. In the weeks that followed, Zaria's testimony, once confined to the echoing chambers of a courtroom, found its way into teacher training materials across multiple states. Professional development seminars played clips of her voice, urging educators to listen for pain that wasn't always visible, to ask why a child might hesitate before eating, and to trust those young voices when they spoke of injustice. One district superintendent in Oregon wrote to say he had reworked his own school's lunch protocols after watching her video. Another in New York sent samples of revised training modules bearing her name as a guiding principle. Zaria, who had feared that her truth might be forgotten once the headlines faded, now learned that her words would resonate in classrooms thousands of miles from her own. Meanwhile, Amara's schedule filled with speaking engagements on education reform and racial equity. Invitations arrived from city councils, state legislative committees, and nonprofit coalitions. She spoke at a symposium on child welfare, emphasizing how early negligence can curdle into systemic harm, and appeared on a public radio panel on institutional accountability. Wherever she went, she invoked her daughter's story not as a singular tragedy, but as a blueprint for action. Checklists for safe food storage, channels for anonymous reporting, and policies protecting whistleblowers from swift retaliation. Her calm, authoritative presence, tempered by the fierce love of a mother, drew standing ovations in auditoriums that once had questioned her motives. Through each engagement, she carried Zaria's sketchbook in her tote, its vine and light sketches a reminder of what blooms when truth breaks through concrete. Perhaps the most poignant moment in this season of healing came with the return of Mr. Bernal. After months of advocacy by civil rights attorneys and letters from across the country, members of Congress intervened on his behalf to secure a work visa, recognizing that his testimony and continued service were vital to the community's renewal. One crisp morning, he slipped quietly into Zaria's homeroom classroom, where a cluster of 7th graders were poring over a lesson on civic engagement. The teacher paused and introduced him simply. "Class, this is Mr. Bernal, the man who helped our community see the truth. He's here today to share why speaking up matters." Mr. Bernal stood before the rows of eager young faces, his custodial uniform replaced by a crisp polo and khakis. He cleared his throat softly before speaking, eyes glistening with gratitude. "When I saw what was happening," he began, "I was terrified. I thought if I said something, I'd lose my job, I'd be shamed, I'd be erased. But then I remembered why I came here in the first place, to serve these children, to keep this school safe for all of you. And I met someone braver than I ever was." He nodded toward Zaria in the back, where she watched with a shy smile. She was the light in a locked room, and she showed me, and all of us, how to find the key. A hush fell over the room before the students erupted in applause. Zaria came forward, and he pulled her into a quick hug that spoke of forgiveness, respect, and the bond forged by shared struggle. In that embrace, every student saw that courage need not roar. It could glow steadily, illuminating the path for others. By the end of the year, the healing that began with a single girl's resolve had spread throughout the town and beyond. The cafeteria no longer bore the scars of its past. Instead, it hums with laughter and conversation. Nutritional menus, crafted in consultation with families, now feature fresh produce and allergy-friendly options. Weekly town hall lunches invite parents and students to sit with administrators and discuss ideas freely. Where once silence had concealed neglect, now dialogue ensured vigilance. And while the courtroom hearings and federal investigations vaulted Jefferson Middle into the national spotlight, the truest transformation was local and ongoing. A community rebuilt on trust, a mother and daughter who turned pain into purpose, and a custodian who reclaimed his place not as a silent bystander, but as a guardian of justice. In the muraled halls and in the hearts of every student who dared to question, their story lives on, an enduring testament to the power of a single voice, refusing to stay silent. Months after the last court date and the unveiling of the mural, a quiet Saturday morning found Zaria and Amara seated side by side at their kitchen table, the sunlight slipping through the blinds in gentle stripes across the wood. On the table between them lay 2 fresh whole-grain sandwiches, turkey and avocado, on artisan bread. An intentional choice by Amara to remind Zaria that food could be safe again, could be an act of care rather than fear. Zaria unwrapped hers slowly, the paper crackling softly, and inhaled the fragrant layers of the avocado before taking her first bite. As she chewed, her eyes met her mother's, and for the first time in a long while, she tasted nothing but relief. The familiar crunch of the bread was a comfort, a whisper of normalcy against months of trauma. Amara watched her daughter with a tender smile, the lines of worry around her eyes softened by the joy of this unremarkable ritual. She picked up her own sandwich, choosing a bite laden with turkey and crisp lettuce, and let the flavors settle into a warm quiet between them. They didn't speak at first. The sounds of the neighborhood waking up drifted faintly through the open window. Lawnmowers humming, distant laughter, the bark of a dog greeting the dawn. With each chew, the weight of the past seemed to settle further behind them. Zaria's shoulders, once tense and hunched, relaxed. Her sketchbook, always within reach, lay closed on the counter, pages filled with images of light and growth rather than rot and shadows. After a moment, Amara reached across the table and brushed a stray lock of hair from Zaria's forehead. "You know," she began, voice soft, "I used to think these mornings would never come back, that I'd always worry about what was in your lunch." She paused and swallowed. The sandwich paused halfway to her lips. "But here we are." Zaria smiled, a slow, genuine curve that reached her eyes. "I almost forgot how good a sandwich could taste," she said, lifting her own in a small toast. "To real food and real mornings." "To mornings," Amara echoed, and they ate together, savoring each bite as though it were a promise kept. When their plates lay empty and the sunlight shifted to golden, they lingered over mugs of tea, sharing plans for the coming week, painting birdhouses in art class, a picnic at the park, perhaps a visit to the mural to see how the flowers in the painting had grown. In the warmth of the kitchen, mother and daughter leaned into each other, anchored by survival and the simple grace of a meal shared without fear. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, they found the sweetest victory of all, the knowledge that, together, they had turned pain into purpose, and that every new sunrise would be theirs to share. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.